We have the absolute honor and privilege today to have the Reverend Dr. John Barclay Burns with us. Yeah, applause, absolutely, thanks, babe. Our new Director of Adult Formation, who currently is at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Rebecca Molly, working towards her doctorate, cannot be here today. However, when she was an undergrad student at George Mason University, she had Dr. Barclay Burns as a professor. And so this is a very fun, full circle formation opportunity that we have this morning. Before I introduce Dr. Burns, though, I do want to highlight a few upcoming events that we have. Dr. Burns will be with us the next 3 Sundays?
Next 2 Sundays.
Next 2, yes, including today. Thank you. Next 2 Sundays. On Saturday, January 28th, and all of this is in the weekly egram, so if you need more information, please look there or ask me, and I'm happy to forward you the information. The Reformed Institute of Greater Washington is having their convocation event at National Presbyterian Church, and Mark Charles is speaking about the injustices of the doctrine of discovery. Saturday, February 4th, there is a Freedom House Museum tour with the Westminster Presbyterian Church Faith and Race Initiative. A very cool event, only $4, what a steal. And then later in February, I know, so cheap. Something that Rebecca and I are very excited about is that we all know that Amy Upton had a passion for mental health and the way that that was a part of the ministry of this church in particular. And on Friday, February 24th, there is a full day mental health first aid training course being led by Unique Union, which is an organization based out of DC. And this mental health first aid training course will give any participant the skills they need to both reach out and provide additional support to someone who may be developing a mental health or substance abuse issue, as well as if that person is in fact themselves. And so it's a bit of self-care as well as first aid for those that are around us. Let us pray. Loving God, we give you great thanks this MLK weekend for beloved community. Be with us as we grow, as we learn, and as we form our faith together. Amen. Amen. Today we have the privilege of having the Reverend Dr. John Barclay Burns with us, who was born and raised in Scotland, born in Glasgow.
And he's been to Glasgow. So
how many of us, raise a hand, will go to Glasgow shortly in a couple of, not bad. Now, how many of us have ever been? Look at all these Glaswegians.
I am a wee snack. You guys are good.
He was educated at amazing institutions, St. Andrews and the University of Glasgow. An ordained minister in the Church of Scotland, he has served parishes in Scotland, in Toronto, Canada, and Providence Presbyterian Church not too far away in Fairfax, Virginia. In 1986, he joined the Religious Studies Department at George Mason University, where he is officially Emeritus faculty. He continues to teach for the department there. He's given multiple seminars at the Smithsonian and teaches regularly for Encore Learning at GMU's Arlington campus. Believe it or not, he does have a life beyond these and is happy to share later at the end of the class if asked. And additionally, and I find this so fun, you happen to hold dual US, UK citizenship.
I have 2 passports.
Dr. Burns, it's wonderful to have you. Thank you so much. Gotcha. Thank you, sir.
Well, it was a kind of a surprise when I got an email from Rebecca, and I'm delighted to be here. I haven't. Most of my lectures are done in a non-church situation, and I haven't done one for a church for quite a long time. And I got up very early this morning, and I was so worried about this that I poured orange juice into my Scottish porridge instead of milk, and arrived here about 45 minutes early. However, here I am, and delighted to be here, and especially to meet Jacob and anybody who has been in Glasgow. Well, you're not going to be graded for this, but you would all get A's if we were graded. So my plan for the next 3 Sundays is, today we're going to look at the historical aspects of the Babylonian exile, then next week, we'll look at the literary consequences, which are enormous. I mean, this is an entire semester collapsed into 3 Sundays. And if I'm giving you too much information, my students learn to do that. And then on the third and final Sunday, we'll look at the consequences for faith and for religion. And that is my plan. We all have watershed events in our life. I recall, and I must just have been about 3 or 4, standing with my grandfather Burns in his church in Inverness, that was totally wrecked. And I still see this, holding his hand, everything broken down, the pulpit lying on one side. And this must have been 1946 or 47. And a German bomber that was returning to Germany, having bombed Clydeside, the shipyards, just decided over Inverness that he would dump his bombs, which hit the Free High Church, now St. Columba's. And the Presbytery of Inverness said, well, we'll just close this church, but the congregation were worshiping in a cinema, which was also designed for closure. And my grandfather said, no, we're going to rebuild the church. So with the help of Polish prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, my grandfather was an engineer, the church was rebuilt. Problem was seating. Wood was scarce. Well, the cinema was closing. So they got the cinema seats. So St. Columba's Church in Inverness was the only church in Scotland where when you got up to sing, your seat popped up. And they had replaced the ashtrays with places for the Bible. So watershed event, good can come out of bad. Now, Jacob, can we take a wee look at the map of the divided kingdoms, please?
Absolutely.
What I say to my students that there are 2 phases. There's the religion of ancient Israel, which runs from about maybe end of the late Bronze Age, around 1200, right down to the exile. And then the exile is what creates Judaism. And so here we see the just during the United Monarchy, the Kingdom of Israel, remember, as I'm sure your pastors have told you, it gets a bad press in the Hebrew Bible. Because it broke away from the Davidic monarchy. It seems to have preserved quite a lot of pre-Israelite religion. And it lasted until around 721, when in a kind of prequel to the Babylonian exile, it was destroyed by the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, peaked around this period. And in 721, it was destroyed. The Assyrians took a lot of the population away, as they did. If we think that immigration and migration is a new thing, no, it's not. And they replaced the population with people taken from other parts of the Assyrian Empire, which meant that although this area survived, the 10 tribes were lost. One of them, of course, crossed the Atlantic and became the ancestor of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we know. But it always became, from the perspective of Judah and Jerusalem, it was slightly tainted. And that's the origin of the Samaritans. You know, the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. But can you put up the siege of Lachish? So the northern kingdom fell, and we know that archaeologically Jerusalem almost doubled in size shortly after that. There was a lot of refugees moved down to Jerusalem and Judah, bringing with them their traditions. Now, in 702 and 701, the Assyrian monarch Sennacherib campaigned in the Levant, and in the reign of King Hezekiah, and he approached Jerusalem, and just before Jerusalem, there was the city of Lachish, which he besieged and which he took just about maybe 20 miles from Jerusalem. And there are a series of these bas reliefs in the British Museum which show the siege of Lachish and which shows what exactly happened during these sieges. And you see here the Assyrian battering rams against the city. You see people fleeing, and the other bas reliefs show people with carts and carrying children and everything else leaving the city and being taken away. There's also a series of small ostraca tablets called the Lachish letters, which are written between Jerusalem and Lachish at this time about supplies and disposition of troops, and written in perfectly good biblical Hebrew, which was a living language. They then besieged Jerusalem, and I'm sure you know, they didn't take it. The Old Testament, of course, says that God intervened, and we have support actually in the Assyrian annals for this event. As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with many smaller towns taken in battle. I took as plunder 200,000 people, small and great, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. Well, Sennacherib went back to Assyria, we think, to deal with issues in the Eastern Assyrian Empire. And this gave a kind of trigger that the promises of God to the Davidic dynasty had been fulfilled yet again. You know, here was this enormous army that had battered its way all the way through the Levant, got within 20, well, besieged Jerusalem, but didn't take it. And so the prophet Jeremiah, at the time of the Babylonian exile, who took a kind of realistic point of view, saying, you know, Jerusalem is going to fall, which made him very unpopular. But he said, there's no point rushing around saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, because this is not going to save you. So during the period between 700 and our exile, the Assyrian Empire waned. The Assyrian Empire fell in 612 to the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The little book of the prophet Nahum is a kind of rejoicing song over the fall of Assyria. And the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Chaldean Empire, took power in Mesopotamia, and most famously under Nebuchadnezzar II. And he campaigned, and if we think, you know, if we think that Jordan, Israel, Syria is a troubled period, it's always been a troubled period. I mean, that's just the way life is. And he besieged Jerusalem in 597, and he took away the king, the royal family, King Jehoiakim, and you know, various people, and put a puppet king, Mattaniah, who changed his name to Zedekiah, on the throne. And we do have from the Babylonian Chronicle, a little supporting text. The king of Babylon in the 7th year, in the month of Kislev, marched to the Hatti land, that's the Levant. He campaigned against the city of Judah, and on the 2nd day of Adar, he took the city and captured the king, and appointed a king of his own choice, received tribute, and sent it to Babylon. So that the narrative at the end of 2 Kings and the Chronicle connect. And we have a little note from the Babylonian palace records of oil being given to the sons of the king of Yahudu, 10 sila of oil to Yakinu, the son of the king of Yakudu. So this is Jehoiakim, the king of Israel, the king of Judah. Jacob, could we have the black obelisk, please, just quickly? Nebuchadnezzar, the next 10 years, we always talk about foreign policy. The foreign policy of Judah during the next 10 years was a disaster. And he came back. Yes, this is just, I omitted this one when we were doing the fall of the northern kingdom. This is an interesting obelisk for Shalmaneser V, the black obelisk, and this is the king of Israel, Jehu, whom you probably remember was the one who overthrew Ahab and Jezebel when she got chucked out of the window. But here he is paying tribute to the king of Assyria, and the inscription reads, Yahu Mar, the man of Beit Humriah, the house of Omri, which was the northern kingdom, giving tribute. So that this is a pattern that led to the fall of the northern kingdom and then ultimately to the Babylonian exile. And so in 587 or 586, Nebuchadnezzar returned. This time he did take Jerusalem. If you've read the last chapter of 2 Kings, you will know all of this. He removed the king, he blinded him, he destroyed the city wall, he burned and looted the temple and the royal palace, and he exiled the wealthiest, the talented, and the useful. He did not, unlike the Assyrian king in 721, he did not bring people from other parts of the empire into Judah, but he certainly took the best and the brightest away. And as we know from the book of Ezekiel, their first settlement, of course, in Babylon was called Tel Aviv, which is why, of course, Tel Aviv was named, being the first major settlement of the new state of Israel. The traditional view always was that Judah was totally destroyed, and only there were a few poor Scrabble farmers around. More recently, this has been kind of debunked, that life did go on. There may well have been sacrifices in the ruined temple. The idea that everything stopped is just simply not true. But the major consequence of this was that the Jews became scattered. I'm sure you know the word diaspora. And the biggest scattering was, of course, to Babylonia, to Babylon. And the Jewish communities there appear to have thrived, they appear to have prospered. We have records from the 4th century BC of a Jewish banking house in Nippur in southern, what is now Iraq, with Jewish names. And the Babylonian diaspora thrived really until about the 1950s, when Jews in the Jewish community in Mesopotamia or in Iraq began naturally to drift to Israel, and for a whole variety of reasons. But for example, during the Abbasid Caliphate, the chief rabbi of the Jewish communities in Iraq was a member of the Caliph's Council. In the Middle Ages, it was safer to be a Jew under Islam, who merely taxed you, as opposed to under Western Christianity, which tended to kill you. And the diaspora community in Babylon, as we'll see in the next two of our talks, is the one that gave shape to what would become Judaism. And so Judah, Yehud, is the name. If you are a male Jew in Hebrew and Aramaic, you're a Yehudi, Yehuda if you're a lady, and Yehudim if you're a plural male, and Yehudot if you're a plural lady. And that's why we make the distinction between ancient Israel from the United Kingdom, attributed to David and Solomon, and then Jerusalem and Judah. And there was another diaspora to Egypt, which is a kind of forgotten one. But in the book of Jeremiah, poor old Jeremiah gets taken off to Egypt. And the Egyptian diaspora was different in that that was a diaspora of flight. The Babylonian diaspora was a diaspora of transfer of population. It was supervised by the Babylonians. And we don't know much about the Egyptian diaspora. We know that Jeremiah has a confrontation. I think it's around chapters 43 or 45. Jeremiah is a long and dense book, only slightly less and less dense than Ezekiel, which has caused people to have problems. Jeremiah is with the exilic community in Egypt, and they complain to Jeremiah that while they worship the Queen of Heaven, the mother goddess, and the sun, the moon, and the stars during the reign of King Manasseh, who is a bad king, but who manages 55 years of peace and prosperity, that they say to Jeremiah, when we did that, things were good. The minute Josiah came along and stopped all of these things, things got bad. And Jeremiah, of course, rebukes them. But there is a gap thereafter between that and the Jewish community in Alexandria, the Hellenistic community that we'll meet when we look at the literary consequences. There is an interesting little group of Jewish mercenaries that seem to have flourished around, between 450 and maybe 390 in Aswan, in Upper Egypt, at the island of Elephantine. And they appear to have had a small temple to God, which was destroyed by the local Egyptian priests because the Jews inevitably at Passover had been sacrificing lambs and rams. And the patron Egyptian god of that nome, that district, was the ram-headed god Khnum. And of course, his animal was a Aram and was therefore safe. And we have Aramaic letters to the Persian government, to the temple in Jerusalem, asking if they can rebuild their temple. And we have wills and real estate transactions. But again, it's just, there were Jews in Egypt, and they had their own little temple. But they too, we kind of lose them. And then it's not until the Ptolemies and Alexandria that the large Jewish community there returns. And so we have this shift, and it's a slow shift that takes place over the years, from a territorial space to a periphery that is powerful. Remember that Paul comes from the periphery, which bothers him because he always feels slightly inferior to those who come from the Jerusalem center. A powerful periphery with a magnetic center. And so Jerusalem goes from being a small, relatively small town in the Judean hill country to becoming this, navel of the world, this peripheral center that it still is to this day for three world religions. I've just finished a book by a chap called Andrew Lawler, who's actually a journalist, but it's called Under Jerusalem. And it's a history, have you read it?
No.
But it's well worth a read because it's the history of the excavation of Jerusalem from the mid-19th century to the present. And it's depressing, utterly depressing. Religious extremism, nationalism, the ignoring of locals, and the destruction of I always feel that it would be nice if we could just get everybody out of Jerusalem and dig top to bottom, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime, which is getting increasingly short. So, but Jerusalem then moves to become this center with this powerful periphery. And from then on, there is a constant tension and contact between the periphery and the center. I mean, Jerusalem is an ancient city. Jacob, what other things do I have on the, I keep forgetting. My elderly brain.
We have Isaiah, Judaism, and Hezekiah.
Yeah, pop that one up just for a minute. I'm going ahead of myself. As Richard III says, but yet I run before my horse to market. Edward still lives. There we are. Yes. Yeah, this again is the I get quoted. This is after the fall of the Northern Kingdom, and one of the things that I always say to students is the distances are short. It's no bigger than Scotland, for example. And Scotland, like Judah and Jerusalem, has an influence far beyond itself. But we'll come back to that. So Jerusalem, but Jerusalem excavations do show that it existed as far back as 3000 BC. It's an ancient city. There's a collection of letters called the Amarna letters, which were discovered at Tel Amarna in Egypt. A lady was wandering across a deserted site looking for material to fertilize her lands in the late 19th century. And she saw these cuneiform tablets, and of course alerted whoever was in charge of Egypt at the time. And they discovered that these were letters written in the reign of Amenhotep III, and then Amenhotep IV, who became, of course, Akhenaten, from the little Canaanite city-states to the Egyptian chancery at Amarna, at Akhetaten, the great city that Akhenaten built in the middle of nowhere to worship the sun. And there are 4 letters from the ruler of Jerusalem, 4 little cuneiform tablets. And all of these little city-states were vying with one another. They were complaining that one was disloyal to Egypt, another one was loyal. And the chap who was running Jerusalem was a chap called Abdi Heba, servant of the Hittite goddess Hebat. So Jerusalem is old, but of course it becomes in a sense more than itself. It becomes the center of this diaspora, this magnetic center, this kind of navel of the world, which of course all temples believe that they were in the ancient Near East. The Neo-Babylonian dynasty didn't survive Nebuchadnezzar all that long. He was succeeded by his son Nabonidus, who seems to have been a bit of an oddball. He had a mother to whom he was devoted, who was a very hands-on. We have letters to Mummy from him. And she was always telling him what to do. She was a priestess of the moon goddess at Haran, but she kept an eye on her son and was probably on her cell phone all the time. But he was an antiquarian, and he sloshed around lower Mesopotamia, restoring all the ancient Sumerian temples, while the rest of the empire went to pot. Well, pot, not in that sense, but to pot. And so when the new rising power to the east in what is now Iran, Afghanistan, the Persians or the Medes appeared, the days of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty were numbered. And of course, that's recorded in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar's feast with the writing on the wall. And Cyrus conquered Babylon around maybe 540-ish BC, and it became part of the then Persian Empire, which would last until Alexander the Great. It would last 200 years. The early Persian kings, like Cyrus, their policy was, if we keep the periphery happy, the empire will thrive. So there is a cylinder, which I didn't photocopy, but there is what's called the Cyrus cylinder, in which he argues that the city god of Babylon had chosen him. And we'll come back to that when we look at Isaiah 40 to 55 next week. He says that he was chosen by the city god of Babylon, a chap called Marduk, to replace the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, which had done all kinds of bad things. But he says, although he doesn't mention the Jews directly, he says that he allowed captured people to go home and rebuild their temples. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, did Ezra come first? Did Nehemiah come first? Who cares? I mean, it's an ongoing debate. It makes you pour orange juice into your porridge. Whoever came first or last, it doesn't matter. They are books that describe the increasing contact between the Babylonian diaspora and the center. And so people like Nehemiah and Ezra go back from Babylon, where they have prospered. There's a theme in the later books of the Old Testament. It's in the story of Joseph, and it's certainly in the books of Daniel. You know, how do I make it in a foreign land? Well, in the case of Joseph and Daniel, you're intelligent, you're wise, and you're also good looking, which kind of helps, apparently. And these books are almost sort of the old Latin term vademecums on how to prosper in a foreign land. But some do return. You know, it's not been that long, it's been 40 or so years. And some do return, and as we'll see from the great chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah, the call to return as a kind of new exodus was a strong one. What we'll see that the exiles do is, once doubtless they have settled, and it's a difficult question, you know, how do we preserve ethnicity? Do we want to preserve ethnicity? Do we want to be absorbed? You know, my grandmother Burns' sister, my great aunt Mary, way back in 1905 or 6, she married an American who was in Scotland learning Scottish milling techniques for whatever reason, I don't know. But she moved back to the States with him. She never came back to Scotland. You know, that was it. She had 6 children. I have so many second cousins in New Jersey, I can barely, Pennsylvania, I can barely count them. But she never came back. There were the wartime parcels with copies of the National Geographic, tinned fruit, powdered soup. My mother made excellent soup, but the powdered soup came from America, so it was great. And so most people didn't return. And some people, very few did. Well, here we see the tension. So by the time we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, which is about 100 years on, middle of the 4th century, the Jews in the strange land have begun to answer the question in Psalm 131, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Which is a lovely psalm, if you take out a little bit at the end, where they hope that Babylonian babies will be dashed against the wall. The Old Testament needs a little bit of, it's a wonderful book, but it needs a little bit of filtering. But they have made decisions about certain things. How do they sing the Lord's song in a strange land, and how do they identify themselves ethnically? Some would absorb, but clearly there was a group who didn't, you know, who wanted to maintain their ethnicity. And over this 100-year period, it's that we suffered. So when we go back to Jerusalem, we're going to tell you where you're going wrong. And of course, when Ezra and Nehemiah get back to Jerusalem, and we see this in the last chapters of Isaiah 55 through 66, that they find that a lot of the old religious customs are still in place. Because the entire Hebrew Bible, the entire Old Testament, the entire Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writing, are designed to answer one question: why did God destroy Jerusalem? You know, it's the 9/11 moment for Jerusalem. And the entire Hebrew Bible is designed to answer that question. Strange though it may seem, it was created to answer that question in its development. Why did God do this to us? So the idea of the return, which we get in Ezra, Nehemiah, Isaiah 40 through 55, did work. People came back. By 518, the temple was rebuilt or restored. And, you know, there's the complaint, I think it's in Ezekiel, that there is the complaint that it doesn't look as good as the temple that was there before. You know, the previous minister was always better than the present one. The previous doctor always cured more people than the present. The argument that it wasn't that it wasn't just so good, but that is what we call the Second Temple, and this is the Second Temple period. It will then be completely reconstructed by King Herod, who gets very bad press, a bit like Richard III, but he actually did quite a lot for Jerusalem and Judea, which he was not appreciated for. So the temple was rebuilt. This meant that it would have revenues that would come from the diaspora, that people could again make pilgrimages to Jerusalem, as in this year here, next year in Jerusalem. And what happens in this period is that the Davidic dynasty, of course, comes to an end. There are early fragments of text that mention the house of David from small inscriptions from the 9th and 8th century BC. And clearly, one of the names for Judah was just the house of David, the Beit David. And as far as we know, and the Old Testament presents it as such, that there was always somebody from the Davidic dynasty to succeed. You know, unlike poor Henry VIII, who had to be a serial polygamist, there was always wives and as one small child in Scotland once wrote, Solomon had 300 wives and 700 cucumbers. There were always wives and cucumbers. So this entire period that we are now facing, exile is over, communities beyond Judah and Jerusalem are established. They create their own ways of survival. They create a literature, which we'll look at in as much detail as we can manage next Sunday. And there is a shift from the religion of ancient Israel to what will become Judaism, with a universalist monotheism, which of course will then percolate into Christianity and into Islam. And it's just one quick little comment on languages. Like Professor Tolkien, I've never met a language that I don't like. My brother Alan, who lives in the UK, we were Skyping yesterday. We Skype usually on Sundays, but not for the next 3 Sundays, because I'll be here and attending church, to which I'm looking forward keenly. He was saying that one of his Christmas presents, not from me, had been yet another Tolkien book, you know, the Fall of Numenor, which he has just worked through. But languages are important because at the beginning of our period, at the time of the siege of Jerusalem in 701, Aramaic. Do you have that picture of the 2 scribes, the Syrian scribes? Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Near East had been Akkadian, which is a Semitic language like Hebrew, written in cuneiform, and is recognizably Semitic. people used it. It's cumbersome. You need a minimum of 400 signs. But this is a scene of Assyrian scribes. And as I say to students, the one with the pen in his hand and the tablet, it's not his cell phone, but he's writing in Akkadian in the Babylonian cuneiform. And the one behind him is holding a piece of parchment or papyrus, and he's writing in Aramaic, which of course is alphabetic. Now, it's easier to learn. Does it mean that more people in the ancient Near East were literate when alphabets came in? No, it doesn't. Because most people were working for their next meal. So Akkadian gave way to Aramaic, and Aramaic became like English in many countries, became the standard language of diplomacy from the beginning of the Persian Empire, imperial Aramaic, right down to the coming of Alexander the Great, when it was ultimately replaced by Greek, by Koine Greek, which of course is what the New Testament is written in. Latin really doesn't much concern us, since it's the language of the Western Roman Empire. And Hebrew became a classical language. It was used obviously by scholars and by priests in the temple. But when Hezekiah's siege of Jerusalem was taking place, the commander of the Assyrian army is addressing the royal court that's standing on the walls of Jerusalem, and he's talking to them in Hebrew. And the royal officials say to the commander of the Assyrians, don't talk to us in Hebrew, talk to us in Aramaic, because we don't want the people to hear what you're saying, as in, we're going to destroy the city and you're all going to be taken away. So you can see at this time that Aramaic, Hebrew, the first 7 chapters of Daniel are in Aramaic. There are 2 letters in Ezra that are in Aramaic, and a verse in Jeremiah that's in Aramaic. And Aramaic was the spoken language of Judah, right through the time of Jesus, who spoke Palestinian Jewish Aramaic. And so the empires go along with this. It is the age of empire. The Persian, the empire of Alexander the Great, who was succeeded, of course, by his 3 generals. Ptolemy, who ultimately got Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, a chap called Seleucus, who got what is now sort of Syria, Iraq, and founded the Seleucid dynasty. Ptolemies are easier because they're all called Ptolemy until you get to Cleopatra. Just read a new biography of Cleopatra. I'm a big fan of Cleopatra. Not Elizabeth Taylor, but a big fan of Cleopatra, who actually was the only Ptolemy to speak Egyptian. She spoke 7 languages fluently. She was a very clever lady. But there we are. So then you have the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemies, Seleucids, who kind of fought in the 3rd and 2nd century over Syria, Palestine. And then, of course, you had the coming of the Romans. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey attacked and captured Jerusalem. The famous story is that he marched into the temple to see what was in the Holy of Holies, pulled back the curtain, and of course there was nothing there. And then at the end of our period, it becomes a part of the Roman Empire. But it's a time for Judaism, and I'll stop now for questions. It's a time of religious ferment. It's a time of political tensions and imperial conflicts throughout this age of empires. But the great paradox is that all of these empires have kind of come and gone, and the concerns of this tiny little temple state, because the Davidic dynasty is gone, And the high priest is sometimes the governor, sometimes there's a state-appointed governor. But the concerns of this little temple state are still with us. So that's the kind of, and I'm sure you know a lot of this, but that's the historical background to what we'll do next week, which is the creation of this enormous body of literature, which I will try to distill. There's a lovely Scottish word, deeve, D-E-E-V-E, which basically means to bore, but it means to bore to absolute distraction. My nephew yesterday sent me some pictures of the wee baby that was born in November. And Ian, of course, grew up in England because Alan was living in England at the time. So, and Ian's a graduate of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, the University of London. So he has a very strong English accent. But he's beginning to get Scotticisms because he's married a nice Scottish girl and they're living in Edinburgh. So he said, "Dear John, here are the most recent pictures of Jensen. I hope they don't deave you." There's all these pictures of this little baby yawning, sleeping. I can hardly wait to get my hands on him because he's the cutest little thing. So I'll try not to deave you with too much literature and maybe give you some extra notes. So I'm open to questions. We have a wee bit of time before we need to gather ourselves together for the Sunday service. Yes, ma'am.
I recently met a Palestinian man in where I work, and
Uh-huh.
he very recently has come here from Palestine, Israel area. What do you know what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians now that the new regime was taken over?
Yeah, well, it's just that book by Lawler, Under Jerusalem. It's the same as everything. There are faults on both sides, but there's a kind of unholy alliance between the extreme Israeli religious right, the Haredi, and the secular Zionist nationals, and they are currently driving excavations, for example, and so that really is part of the problem. And the idea that Jerusalem is Jewish, no, it's not. It was early Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age. Yes, David captured it and settled it, but there's no particularly Jewish claim to it, at least historically. And in balance, it was a Christian city during the Byzantine Empire, and then coming of Islam, it became an Islamic city. And Islam has in some senses, has more of a claim on it than Christianity, where things took place outside the city wall, where the dear Lord was crucified. So it's just a bad situation. The Palestinians are Netanyahu is a good Hebrew name, Nethaniah, God has given. He's just made an alliance with all of these extreme right-wing groups, and it's just going to have to work itself out. Yes, sir.
As you describe this sort of wave of expansion and contraction of empires, and fighting across several hundred years, Judaism, the Jewish community somehow held as an organized group, as a belief system, as a culture. Were there any other religious groups, cultural groups that held through all of this back and forth, or was Judaism basically the only one?
That's a good question. We'll see in the literature and in the religion section that Judaism kind of split up into different groups, but we all know about the Sadducees, the Sadducees, and the people at the Dead Sea. But whatever their differences, they believed in one God. Exodus, Passover. They shared all of these things, Well, you know, for example, Egyptian religion survived the Ptolemies. But less so in Mesopotamia. I mean, the Mesopotamian religion kind of staggered right down until about maybe 100, 120 CE, when it was overtaken by Zoroastrianism finally. We have some, you know, Sumerian, the first language of ancient Mesopotamia, became like Latin, a kind of classical language. And the last Sumerian texts date from about 100. I have a love-hate relationship with Sumerian. I get to about less. It's like Scottish Gaelic that I've always felt I really ought to, you know, I have about 6 Gaelic grammars with a marker in it, chapter 5, when it gets difficult. It gets difficult in chapter 1, actually. So, yeah. So, but Judaism is the one that seems to stick. And what I also meant to emphasize at the very beginning, this is about real people. You know, these are not fictional. Well, some of them are literary creations, but these are about real people and what they believe. You know, these are acts of faith that, you know, you set up in the Babylonian diaspora. Anything else? Well,
One thing that I put in the chat for everyone that's following along at home is that Under Jerusalem is available at the Alexandria Library.
yeah, it's, I got it at, I live in Falls Church up, Peacock Road on Route 7, if you're sending anybody after me. So you were talking about the 28th for one of your events. 28th, the British Player. The other things that I do a lot of community theatre. And I'm a member of the British Players. In fact, I'm one of the trustees. On the 28th, we're having our annual Burns supper.
Is that the British Embassy?
Yeah, it's the old embassy players that are now the British. After we got kicked out of the after terrorism kicked us out of the embassy, we became the British Players. So we're having our annual Burns supper. So I'm doing the toast to the lassies. And the Selkirk Mills. So.
They don't know musicals still, do they?
Oh, they still do music
Oh,
hall.
wonderful.
Yeah, they still
With
do music hall.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Malcolm Edwards was Mr. Chairman. Yeah, they still do music. We're not doing music hall this year. Next year is our 60th anniversary, 2024. So we're doing a music hall.
Good.
They're doing As You Like It in the spring, and then they're doing something in the summer. I'm going to audition at Little Theatre. They're doing Mary Stuart, so I think I might not audition for Mary Stuart, obviously, but maybe for one of her jailers or her Scottish chaplain. So you may argue you're a shoo-in for a Scottish chaplain. Well, thank you, and we'll I'll gather myself.